Is this really the best you could afford, Camille?
I think I've seen that at a pawn shop.
It belonged to my father.
Tessa's family has connections on 3 continents. You brought me a clock.
Now I know what I needed to know.
That night, Derek Sloan held up the watch I had spent 3 months restoring and turned it into a joke. He didn't ask what it meant. He held it up, let the room laugh, and dropped it on the floor. He chose 200 strangers over the woman who had stood beside him before any of them knew his name. He believed a woman with no title and no wealth could be dismissed without cost. What he didn't know was that I was not who he believed me to be. But would that have changed anything? If this story already has you thinking, you might want to stick around because what happens next is the part nobody in that ballroom saw coming. Subscribe if you haven't yet, so you don't miss the rest. My grandfather never let me call him by anything other than Grandpa Arthur, even after I was old enough to understand that his name appeared on the sides of buildings. Arthur Marlowe had built his empire quietly, the way men of his generation believed real things were built without announcement, without ceremony, and without apology. He ran Marlowe Group, a conglomerate that touched real estate, hospitality, investment, and fine art across 4 decades. But inside the walls of the home where he raised me, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether I had finished my homework and whether I had treated the people around me with basic human decency. My parents died when I was 6, in the kind of accident that leaves no one to blame and nothing to hold on to. Arthur stepped in without hesitation. He was already in his 60s, already the kind of man who could have handed me off to a household of nannies and called it love. Instead, he drove me to school himself on the mornings he was in the city. He made me take a part-time job the summer I turned 16, at a bookshop 3 blocks from our apartment, because he believed that understanding the value of money meant earning it first. He never once let me use his name to open a door, and the few times I tried, he found out and made sure I understood why that mattered. The thing he said most often, in different forms over many years, was some version of the same warning. He told me that money could buy attention, but it could not tell you who actually saw you. He told me that the people worth keeping were the ones who showed up before they had any reason to. And in the final weeks of his life, when the illness had taken most of his strength but none of his clarity, he looked at me from his hospital bed and said it plainly. Don't give your heart to someone who only begins to see you after they know what you own. He died on a Tuesday in October. Graham Keene, the family's lead attorney, and a man who had worked with Arthur for over 20 years, called me into his office 3 days after the funeral. He explained, in careful and measured language, that Arthur had left everything to me, the full portfolio of Marlowe Group, the foundation, the private collection, all of it. He also explained that the transfer of that much power required time, documentation, and discretion. He asked me to keep the inheritance private for a few weeks while the legal work was completed. I agreed without much thought. I was still grieving, and the idea of becoming a public figure felt like something I could afford to put off. So I went back to my life, which looked exactly as it always had from the outside. I had a small apartment above a coffee shop on the Upper West Side. I took the subway to work at a gallery in Chelsea, where I restored paintings and antique pieces, cleaning layers of varnish off 19th century oils, repairing cracks in gilded frames, occasionally returning a damaged sculpture to something close to what it had once been. The work suited me. It required patience and a willingness to care about something quietly, without recognition. I had been doing both my entire life. I had also been with Derek Sloan for 2 years by that point. We met at a gallery opening, back when Derek was pitching a financial technology company to anyone who would listen and most people wouldn't. He was sharp and ambitious and genuinely funny in the way people sometimes are before success teaches them to perform instead of simply be. In those early months, I helped him refine his pitch decks, sat across from him at the kitchen table while he rehearsed for investor meetings, and stayed on the phone with him late into the night after the ones that didn't go well. I never asked him to pay for things he couldn't afford. He never asked me why I seemed comfortable with less than I might have expected. It worked because neither of us was pretending to be something we weren't. That changed when the company started making money. The change was not sudden, which is the thing that made it difficult to name while it was happening. It came in small adjustments: the restaurants he chose, the way he talked about people, the increasing weight he placed on what others in a room thought of him. He began measuring social situations in terms of what they could do for his image, and the people in his life were quietly sorted into categories based on their usefulness. I did not know, for a long time, which category I was in. I assumed that 2 years of loyalty counted for something more durable than whatever was happening on the surface. Then Tessa Rourke came back. She and Derek had dated briefly years before, and she returned now as a potential business partner with family money and the kind of connections Derek had decided he needed. She was polished in the way that comes from never having had to apologize for anything, and she made clear from the first time we were in the same room that she found my presence mildly inconvenient. She asked, in front of Derek and two of his investors, why I still took the subway. She commented on a dress I was wearing at a dinner, noting that it was a style from several seasons back. She said, once, in a voice designed to sound casual, that a woman in Derek's position needed someone beside her who could open certain doors, implying, without quite stating it, that I was not that person. Derek did not defend me. That was the part I kept returning to. He didn't agree with Tessa, exactly, but he laughed when she expected laughter and changed the subject when she expected retreat. He had learned to treat my presence at these events as background, something assumed, but not acknowledged. I kept telling myself it was stress, that the pressure of the company's growth was making him someone he didn't mean to be. I kept waiting for a moment that would tell me clearly whether I was right or wrong to stay. His 34th birthday gave me that moment. Derek booked the grand ballroom of a hotel on Park Avenue. Close to 200 guests, investors, journalists, a handful of people who were famous for reasons I couldn't quite identify, and several international partners who had flown in specifically for the occasion. He had also arranged to use the evening to announce that the company was expanding into 2 new markets, which meant the party was less a celebration and more a performance. He wanted the room to see him as someone who had arrived, permanently and without question, in the world of serious men. I had planned to tell him the truth after the party. I had decided, in the weeks since Arthur's death, that Derek deserved to know who I was, all of it, and I had been waiting for the right moment. That night felt like the threshold. After the guests went home, in the quiet of wherever we ended up, I would tell him about Arthur, about Graham Keane, about Marlowe Group. I wanted to watch his face and hear what he said, and I believed I still believed. That night that he would tell me it didn't change anything. But I also wanted to see how he treated me before he knew. The watch had belonged to my father. It was a pocket watch, English-made, with a case worn smooth from decades of handling. It had stopped working years before my parents died, and I had spent 3 months having it restored under the guidance of an elderly watchmaker in the West Village who treated every piece he handled as though it were the last of its kind. I was not under the illusion that the watch was worth a great deal of money. That was not the point. It was the only object I had from my father that still held the shape of him, and I wrapped it carefully and brought it to the party because I thought Derek knew that kind of value when he saw it. Tessa made her move during the gift portion of the evening. The other presents had been displayed one after another: a watch from a Swiss label, a pair of custom cufflinks, a trip to a private island, a signed piece of art that one of the investors had flown in from London. Then Tessa turned toward me, in front of everyone, with a smile that had nothing warm in it, and asked what a woman like me had brought for a man who could buy himself anything. The room shifted its attention. Derek should have stepped in. He had done it in smaller situations before, or at least I had believed he had. But he was standing in the center of a room that was looking at him, and the look on his face was not discomfort, it was calculation. He asked me to bring the gift up to the front. I carried the box to the stage. I watched him open it. He held the watch up and looked at it for a moment, and I waited for something, any sign of recognition, any flicker of the man who had sat across from me at that kitchen table 2 years ago. Instead, he held it up to the room and asked, in a voice loud enough to carry, whether this was really the best I could manage. Tessa called it a pawnshop find. The people nearest to her laughed first, and the laughter spread the way it does when a crowd decides it's safe to be unkind. Derek looked out at all of it and kept going. He talked about what he had built, what it had taken, and how the woman standing beside him should reflect what he had become. He mentioned Tessa's family, her network, her ability to belong to the world he was entering. He said I had never really fit. Then he dropped the watch. Not drop, set down is too gentle a word for what he did. He let it fall from his hand onto the marble floor, and the glass face shattered into pieces. The sound was small, but the room heard it. Tessa laughed again, and this time almost everyone followed. A few people in the back were already holding up their phones. Derek gestured toward the door and told the security staff to remove me, because I was disrupting the evening. I bent down and picked up the watch. The hands had stopped at the same position they always stopped, the same place they had been frozen when my father carried it in his pocket. I held it in both hands and looked at Derek for a long moment, not with anger, not with tears, but with the particular clarity that arrives when something you had been hoping was not true becomes undeniably confirmed. I said the only thing that was true. Now I knew what I had needed to know. I took off the ring he had given me the previous Christmas and set it on the table beside the empty gift box. Then I turned and walked toward the door. I was 3 steps from the exit when both doors opened from the outside. Graham Keene walked in first, followed by 4 members of the Marlowe Group's senior legal team. They had been trying to reach me for several hours. There was a final document requiring my signature to complete the transfer of executive authority, and the deadline was that evening. They had tracked me to the hotel through my assistant at the gallery. Graham took in the room in the way men who have handled crises for 40 years take in rooms. His eyes moved to the security guard standing near me, to the shattered watch in my hand, and then to Derek, who was already crossing the ballroom toward this unexpected interruption to his evening. Derek asked, with the confidence of a man who still believed he controlled the situation, what purpose this group of attorneys had at his private event. Graham looked at him steadily and asked one question. Had Derek just ordered Camille Marlowe removed from this room? The name settled over the ballroom like a change in air pressure. Several people near the front went very still. Derek's expression shifted, not understanding, not yet, but registering that something had gone wrong in a way he had not anticipated. Graham turned to the room and stated it without preamble. Camille Marlowe was the sole granddaughter of Arthur Marlowe and the designated heir to the entirety of Marlowe Group, an enterprise valued in the tens of billions of dollars. I did not look back at Derek. I did not need to see his face to know what was happening on it. I had seen everything I needed to see before Graham walked through that door, and the announcement changed none of what I had already understood. I walked past Graham, past the legal team, and out into the corridor where the noise of the party could no longer reach me. I kept the broken watch in my hand the entire way down. The car that carried me away from the hotel that night belonged to the Marlowe estate, a detail I had not yet grown accustomed to, the way certain resources had quietly reorganized themselves around me in the weeks since Arthur's death. I sat in the back seat with the broken watch in my lap and watched the city pass through the window, and I did not cry. What I felt was not grief, exactly, though it resembled it. It was the particular exhaustion of having hoped for something longer than the evidence warranted. Derek called for the first time before the car reached my apartment. I watched his name appear on the screen and let it go. He called again 4 minutes later, and then again after that, until somewhere around the 12th attempt, I blocked the number and set the phone face down on the seat beside me. By morning, he had sent messages through 2 other numbers I didn't recognize, borrowed phones, I assumed, belonging to people still willing to do him small favors. I didn't respond to those either. He came to my building the next afternoon. My neighbor, an older woman named Patricia, who had lived on the floor below me for 11 years and had always been kinder to me than the city typically encouraged, told me he had stood in the vestibule for nearly half an hour before leaving. He went to the gallery the following morning and found it locked to him. I had sent my resignation by email at 2 a.m, the night of the party, and my former colleague James, who managed the front desk, had been given quiet instructions not to relay messages. Every letter, every arrangement of flowers, every package that arrived at the Marlowe Group offices over the following week was returned to its sender without being opened. I heard about his attempts not because I was watching, but because Graham mentioned them briefly during our meetings. In the careful and neutral tone of a man who understood that information and interference were not the same thing, Graham never offered an opinion on Derek. He simply kept me informed of what was moving in my direction and trusted me to decide what to do with it. What I was doing, mostly, was working. The transfer of executive authority had been completed the morning after the party, and the weight of what that meant arrived not as triumph but as obligation. There were foundation board meetings to attend, introductions to be made to department heads who had served Arthur for decades and were now studying me with the careful attention of people whose futures depended on the quality of their assessment. There were decisions about the private collection, which pieces to loan, which institutions to partner with, which communities had been underserved by the kind of access Marlowe Group could now provide. I threw myself into all of it with the focused energy of someone who had discovered that purpose, when it is real, leaves very little room for the kind of pain that requires an audience. It was during this time that I began to understand what Arthur had actually given me. Not the money, not the properties, not the name that made rooms go quiet. What he had given me was a model. He had spent 40 years building something substantial and had treated everyone around him, the assistants, the drivers, the people who cleaned his offices at night, with the same basic respect he extended to the architects and financiers and politicians who sat across conference tables from him. I had absorbed this so completely, I no longer noticed it as a principle. It was simply how I moved through the world. I was thinking about all of this one afternoon when the letter arrived. I had not written to Derek, and I had not expected to hear from him through anything as considered as a handwritten letter. But the envelope on my desk had his name in the return address corner, written in the same slightly cramped handwriting I had watched compose hundreds of notes and margin comments over 2 years, and I opened it because something about the object itself, its quietness, its patience in having traveled through actual mail rather than through a phone screen, made me willing to see what it contained. He wrote that he had spent the days since the party reconstructing everything, the way you reconstruct an accident after the fact by working backward from the wreckage. He said he had thought, at first, that the problem was not knowing who I was. That had been his first available defense, and he had used it briefly before it collapsed under its own weight, because the thing he kept returning to was not the night of the party. It was every night before it, every time Tessa had said something dismissive and he had let it stand, every dinner where he had maneuvered himself toward the more impressive guests and left me at the edge of the conversation, every small moment where he had calculated the social cost of standing beside me and decided the arithmetic didn't work in his favor. He was not asking to come back. He was not, as far as I could tell, asking for anything. He was simply putting the truth in writing, the way people sometimes need to do before they can believe it themselves. I wrote back. I had not planned to, but I sat down at the desk in the study that had been Arthur's, the same desk where he had signed documents and read correspondence and occasionally just sat in the early morning with a cup of tea, thinking, and I wrote Derek a single page in return. I told him that what had broken at that party was not the watch. Watches can be repaired. What had broken was something that had been under pressure for much longer than one evening, and the crack had been forming every time he chose to look away. I wrote that he had not humiliated me because he disliked the gift. He had humiliated me because the room was laughing, and in that moment, their approval meant more to him than my dignity. That was not a mistake of ignorance. That was a revelation of priority. I did not mail the letter for 3 days. When I finally sent it, I felt something release in my chest, not forgiveness. Exactly. But the beginning of the process that would eventually lead there, on my own timeline and without any obligation to perform it for anyone else's comfort. Meanwhile, the video found its audience. Someone at the party I never learned who had posted 2 separate clips in the hours after the event. The first showed Derek holding up the watch, delivering his comparison between me and Tessa and gesturing toward the security staff. The second showed Graham's entrance and the public announcement of my identity. Both clips circulated independently for about a day before someone edited them together into a single sequence, and that version moved through the internet with the velocity that only genuine human recognition can produce. People were not sharing it because it was dramatic. They were sharing it because they had seen some version of that room before the performance of contempt dressed as humor, the crowd that laughs because laughing is safer than refusing to, and the sequence of events that followed gave them something they rarely received in real life, an immediate and visible consequence. The damage to Derek came quickly and from several directions at once. 2 investors withdrew from the international expansion not publicly, but their representatives communicated the decision in language that left no ambiguity about the reason. The board convened an emergency session. Several partnerships that had been in late-stage negotiations simply went quiet, the kind of quiet that eventually becomes permanent. Tessa's situation was, in some ways, more precise. The first clip showed her clearly, her laughter, her comment about the pawn shop, the way she had engineered the moment that gave Derek permission to continue. The guests who had been nearby began to fill in details on social media, and the picture that emerged was not of a bystander caught in someone else's bad behavior. It was of someone who had lit the match. A manufacturing executive with whom Tessa had been in serious negotiations released a brief statement through his office, noting only that he was reconsidering certain professional relationships in light of recent events. Her father called her personally. I heard about this through a mutual acquaintance and took no satisfaction in it, but I noted it. Tessa retained a crisis communications firm and vanished from public events for the better part of 4 months, reappearing only carefully and in controlled settings. She had the resources to manage the fallout, and she would eventually manage it. But the version of herself that had walked into Derek's party with the confidence of someone whose social position was unassailable did not walk out the other side unchanged. I followed none of this directly. What I knew came to me through Graham, through occasional mentions in the business press, through the peripheral awareness that comes from occupying a position people consider worth reporting on. I did not track Derek's losses. I did not speak to journalists who called asking for a response. When a reporter from a business publication asked, at a foundation event, whether I had any comment on what had happened, I told her that I was focused on the work ahead and left it at that. The work ahead was, genuinely, what occupied me. I read through the scholarship applications for a new education initiative, personally hundreds of them, from students in cities where the arts remained chronically underfunded. I attended the opening of a community studio in the Bronx that the foundation had helped build, and I stayed for 2 hours after the formal program ended, talking to the teenagers who had started using the space. I flew to Detroit to meet with a program director who had been running youth arts workshops out of a church basement for 12 years without institutional support, and I left that meeting having committed to 3 years of sustained funding. None of this made the news in the way the party had. It was simply what the money could do when it was pointed in a useful direction. 4 months after the party, I attended the public opening of a community arts center in Brooklyn that the foundation had supported, a converted warehouse space that had taken nearly 2 years to bring to completion and represented the kind of project Arthur had always believed in. Art as infrastructure, not luxury. There were speeches, a ribbon cutting, a reception afterward where several hundred people moved through the newly opened galleries. I was standing near the exit, preparing to leave, when Derek appeared at my side. He did not reach for my arm or position himself in a way that would have made refusal awkward. He stood a few feet away and spoke quietly, with the controlled directness of someone who had rehearsed not a speech but a boundary. He was not going to make a scene. He was not going to ask for more than I was willing to give. And if I wanted to walk away immediately, he would not follow. He said he was not there to ask me to come back. He said he only wanted to say one thing, once, and then he would leave me alone permanently if that was what I wanted. Something in the absence of pressure made me willing to hear it. We walked to a small park 2 blocks from the arts center, away from the reception and the photographers and the particular weight of being recognized in public. The evening was cool and the park was mostly empty, and we stood near a bench without sitting down. Derek said that for most of his adult life, he had understood his own value in terms of what the room thought of him. He said that when the crowd at his party began to laugh, he had felt something he recognized as fear, not of me, but of becoming the one they were laughing at. So he had made the easiest available choice, which was to join them. He said this without asking me to understand it, only to know it. He told me he had loved me before he knew about any of it, the inheritance, the name, the scope of what Arthur had built, and he asked if there was any way to demonstrate that the man he was now was different from the man in that ballroom. I listened to all of it. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. I asked, if Graham had not walked through those doors that night, if I had remained in his understanding nothing more than a gallery employee with no useful connections and no claim to anyone's attention, would he be standing here now? Derek opened his mouth. I watched him try to find the answer that was both honest and the one he wanted to give. Those two things were not the same, and he knew it, and the silence that followed was not a failure of language. It was the most truthful thing he had said all evening. I told him that I believed he was sorry. I believed the man in front of me was genuinely different from the one who had let the watch fall. But I did not need to go back in order to confirm that. His change was real, or it wasn't, and neither outcome required my presence to become true. I walked to the car that was waiting at the curb, and I did not look back as we pulled away from the park. The drive back from that park stayed with me longer than I expected, not because of what Derek had said, but because of what his silence had confirmed. He had tried to find the answer and couldn't, and I had recognized in that moment that I no longer needed him to find it. Something had finished. Not dramatically, not with the sharp relief I might have imagined in the weeks after the party, but quietly, the way grief finally loosens its hold when you stop trying to rush it. What required my attention now was everything else. In the months that followed, I came to understand that inheriting Arthur's position was not simply a matter of inheriting his resources. It was inheriting his relationships with the people who had worked for him, with the institutions he had supported, with the communities whose trust he had built slowly and maintained carefully over decades. Those relationships did not transfer automatically. They had to be earned again, in real time, by someone who had not yet proven herself to the people who had loved and respected him. I was aware, in every meeting and every public appearance during that period, that I was being measured. I tried to be worth the measurement. I kept doing what I had always done, which was to pay attention to the people in the room that others tended to overlook. The intern who brought coffee to the board meetings. The overnight security staff in the Marlowe Group offices who had known Arthur for 15 years and who greeted me, the first time I introduced myself to them by name, with a surprise they didn't quite manage to conceal. The program coordinators at the foundation, who had been running significant operations on modest budgets for years, waiting for leadership that would actually listen rather than simply direct. I made it a point to learn what they had been trying to build and to ask what had been standing in their way. Arthur had told me once that real power was invisible from the outside. It looked like courtesy. It looked like patience. It looked like a woman who remembered your name 6 months after meeting you once, who asked about the project you'd mentioned in passing and actually wanted to hear how it was going. I had always thought he was describing himself. Sitting in his chair, I began to understand he had also been describing a possibility for me. The choice not to retaliate had been easy in the immediate aftermath of the party, when I was still operating on the clarity that comes with shock. It became more considered as the months passed, and the tools available to me became more apparent. I had, without particularly seeking it, the capacity to make Derek's professional recovery significantly more difficult. I knew people who knew his remaining investors. I could have placed 1 or 2 calls, mentioned a name, allowed a certain kind of information to circulate in the right rooms. It would have required almost no effort and produced visible results. I did not make those calls. Not because I was certain I was above the impulse, I was not always certain, but because I understood what making them would mean about where I had located the center of my life. If I organized my energy around Derek's destruction, then Derek remained the organizing principle of my life. Arthur had not left me an empire, so I could use it to settle a personal account. And more than that, I did not want to become the kind of person who mistook the capacity to harm for the right to do so. Instead, I went to work. The scholarship program expanded into 7 cities in the year following the party. We funded it through a restructured portion of the foundation's existing endowment, which had been underutilized in that area for years. I read applications on Saturday mornings, in the study that had been Arthur's, at the same desk where I had written the letter to Derek. The applications came from students who were talented in ways that formal metrics struggled to capture. A 17-year-old in Memphis who had been teaching herself oil painting from library books. A young man in Phoenix who had built a community mural project with no funding and considerable opposition from the property owners whose walls he had politely, persistently asked to use. These were not people who needed someone to believe in them for the first time. They needed someone with resources to recognize what they were already doing and remove the obstacles in the way. That felt to me like the right use of what I had been given. Through all of this, I heard occasional fragments of Derek's situation through the ordinary circulation of information in overlapping professional worlds. He had resigned his position. He had sold the majority of his stake in the company at a value considerably lower than it might have reached under different circumstances. He had left New York. The details came to me passively, and I received them without satisfaction or distress. The way you receive news about weather in a city you no longer live in. What I learned much later, through an indirect source, was the volunteer work. A director of a workforce development organization mentioned, in a conversation about foundation partnerships, that they had a former corporate executive who had been coming in on weekends for several months, working one-on-one with clients preparing for job interviews. She noted how unusual it was for someone with his background to show up without any apparent interest in recognition, no mention of his previous career, no visible expectation that the work would lead anywhere for him personally. She didn't say his name. I found out afterward, through a connection I won't detail, that she had been describing Derek. I sat with that for a while. It did not change what had happened between us, and it did not change my decision. But it was the first evidence I had received that his change might be something other than performance, and I acknowledged it to myself, honestly rather than dismissing it. About a year and a half after the night of the party, I attended an exhibition opening at a gallery in Midtown that the foundation had supported through its early institutional partnerships. It was a smaller event than most of the public functions I attended, more focused on the work itself than on the people in the room, which was the kind of gathering I had always preferred. The artist was someone who had received one of our early grants and whose practice had developed into something genuinely significant. I stood in front of one of the larger pieces for a long time, the way I used to stand in front of paintings when it was simply my job to understand them, without anyone watching or expecting anything from me. That was when I saw Derek. He was standing near the entrance, not approaching, not drawing attention to himself. He looked different, not dramatically, but in the way that people look different when they have stopped performing. The particular tension that had always lived in his shoulders, the readiness to calibrate himself to whatever the room required, was absent. He was simply standing there, looking at the work, and when his eyes met mine across the gallery, he did not manufacture anything in his expression. He just looked at me, with a steadiness that acknowledged everything and asked for nothing. I gave him a small nod. He returned it. He did not cross the room. I did not cross the room. We remained where we were, and after a moment I returned my attention to the painting in front of me, and when I glanced back a few minutes later, he had moved to look at a different piece and was not watching me. I stayed for another hour. When I left, I did not search the room for him, and I did not feel the need to. On the drive home, I thought about the watch. It was still in my possession, placed in a small wooden box on the shelf in Arthur's study, next to a photograph of my parents and a folded letter that Arthur had left with Graham to be delivered to me after his death. The watchmaker in the West Village had told me, when I first brought the piece to him, that the damage to a watch's movement was rarely as permanent as it appeared. Most of what seemed irreparably broken could be addressed if someone was willing to take the time. He had spent 3 months proving that to me, returning the watch in working order, its hands moving again after years of stillness. The watch had been restored. That was true and real and worth what it had cost. But the moment when it fell on the marble floor of that ballroom, when the glass face cracked and the room laughed, that moment had also happened and remained part of the object's history. You could hold both things at once. The restoration was real. The breaking was also real. They did not cancel each other out. I had walked out of that ballroom with the broken watch in my hand and my ring left on the table, and every decision I had made since then had come from that moment of clarity. I had not made those decisions in order to punish Derek. I had not made them to prove something to the room that had laughed. I had made them because I understood, standing there with the shattered glass in my palm, that I was not willing to remain in a life that required me to wait for someone else to decide I was worth protecting. Arthur had raised me to know my own value without requiring confirmation from outside. The inheritance had not given me that. It had simply made it harder for anyone to pretend otherwise. The broken watch would stay on the shelf, not as a wound and not as a trophy, as a record of a moment that had told the truth and of everything that had been built in the time since. That was enough. The way we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us, that's the truest measure of who we are. Camille never needed the inheritance to have dignity. She had it long before the room found out her name. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, consider subscribing. There are more of them here, and every single one is worth your time.